time for the Property Podcast, where every week tens of thousands of property investors, new and experienced, join together to get news, knowledge and laughs at our expense. With me, Rob Bence.
And me, Rob Dix. Join us every Thursday morning for your weekly dose of property ideas and motivation. Then head over to our website at thepropertypodcast.com to keep the conversation going. Now though, let's get started.
Welcome to the Property Podcast. It is episode 44. I'm Rob Bence, and with me every week is Rob Dix. Good morning, Rob. How are you?
Good morning, Rob. Very well, thank you. Thanks for joining us today. We are going to be talking about risk and reward in property investment. Very simple, but very important. Really cuts to the heart of why we're all doing this. And if you stick around, we've got a resource of the week that Rob and I personally tested last week, and it worked really well. So we're going to be telling you about that later on.
We certainly will. But before we get going, we'd like to send some thanks and appreciation to the following people who've been very kind and left us 5-star reviews. James Hawkswood says, really informative podcast, 5 stars. Great podcast, guys. I'm studying the property market and really appreciate both your insights and the positive manner through which the info is delivered. Would recommend to anyone who wants to get a base level of knowledge on the fundamentals of buy-to-let. Keep up the great work. Thanks for your help. Brilliant, says Luke Payne. How could I not leave a review for you guys? You've both given me so much, saved me lots of time and provided me with lots of pointers in the right direction. I most love how you debunk various aspects of the property investment industry through a refreshing and enlightening common sense style approach. You help dispel a lot of the noise that's ever present in the property investment industry. I'm currently going through some great books on property, which again you recommended, and I'm getting objective and hope to make a move soon. Thank you, Mr. Dix, for responding to my emails via Facebook so quickly, and I look forward to the next Property Podcast meetup. I'm sure this show will grow and grow. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Luke. I hope you made the last meetup that we've just had. And most excellent. Rob Ball 5 says, a big thank you to Rob and Rob for a fun and informative look at the property market every week. A must for anyone interested in property investments. I have your podcast on my iPhone and listen whenever I'm in the car. I only have just found you, but I've managed to listen to all your podcasts in 2 days. They're that good. People, what's wrong with you? No, thank you, James, Luke and Rob. We really do appreciate it. They're brilliant reviews. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone who's left a review. Really, really appreciate it. And by the time you're listening to this, we will have had our Property Hub launch party / property podcast listener meetup. We'd love to talk about it, but we are in the past at the moment. It hasn't happened as we're recording this, but I hope everyone had a great time, and we're going to talk about that more in a future episode when it's actually happened for us. Does that make any sense? I feel like I'm losing my grip on timings completely.
Don't worry. Just like Back to the Future, it doesn't have to make sense. It just has to be entertaining.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you for coming to the launch party, or I hope you enjoyed the launch party, or we're looking forward to the launch party. Something's happening with the launch party. We'll get into that in a future episode. But let's move on to something that I know is happening, and it's happening today in real time. Yes, my new book is available to pre-order. Woohoo!
Congratulations, Rob. Book number 2.
Yeah, thank you.
You must have lots of spare time.
Yeah. It's, every time I finish one, I say never again. And this time I think maybe I mean it. It's such an effort to do, but really, really worthwhile. So I've not really talked about this much on the podcast before, but the gist of it is last year I spent a lot of time going around the UK meeting lots of really successful investors, finding out exactly how they did what they've done, and written it all up into a book. So it's basically 9 sort of really long, in-depth interviews with people who've done what you want to do, and they've all done it in a totally different way. And so as part of reading their stories, you can pull out loads and loads of advice about things that you can do, tips you can pick up for what you might want to do. And it's just really interesting on a human interest level as well, because these are people they all started with like a really ordinary number of savings, started with a job just like everyone else, and they've gone and sort of found financial freedom through their investments. So it's really interesting just to read about people who've done unusual things. I'm really, really proud of it. It's coming out on the 20th of February, but you can pre-order it right now. The pre-order started today, and you can pre-order by going to propertygeek.net/beyondthebricks. I should have said that's the name of the book. The link to that will be in the show notes for episode 44, of course. If you do pre-order, it means that you'll get the paperback sent to you on the 20th of Feb, the day it comes out. You'll also get a couple of bonuses. You'll get the ebook thrown in for free, so you can read it on your iPad, on your Kindle, whatever. And you're also going to get an invite to a special Q&A that I'm going to be doing with a special guest where we talk about the book. You'll get to ask your questions live as well if there's any questions you've got after reading it. It should be really good. So I'm not a big one for doing plugs, but I am really, really proud of this. And I think it should be interesting to pretty much everyone who listens to the podcast. So propertygeek.net/beyondthebricks is the place to pre-order. And you can also go and download a sample chapter there completely free to see if it looks like you're going to like it.
I'm really excited for you on this one, Rob, because I think the topic is going to appeal to a lot of people because there's so many business books where people like to read about success stories, how they did it, how they made it. But there isn't, as far as I'm aware, until now, one on property. So I know I'm super keen to get my advanced free copy, hint, hint, and, can't wait to read it and go through and pick up, I'm sure, lots of nuggets myself. So I think it's going to be a very, very popular book.
I hope so. Enough effort went into it, I can tell you that much. But, I find it fascinating because I am, of course, a property geek, but I don't think you have to be quite as obsessed as we are to get a lot out of it. So they're just interesting stories in their own right. So that's my big news for this week. But we should really do some news that isn't just about us as well, shouldn't we?
That's right. We've got our news story back on track. So over Christmas, New Year, obviously things were mixed up a little, but our news story this week is a buy-to-let property tycoon. And I don't use that word lightly. He owns nearly 1,000 properties, has decided he's not going to let property out to people on benefits anymore. He has nearly 1,000 properties and he is giving eviction notices to 200 tenants because he says he prefers private tenants now. And in particular, he mentions Eastern Europeans. He says they won't default as much and they pay more. So that's his choice. And he's also mentioned he's very nervous about the universal credit, which is currently being rolled out. Now, we'll talk about that in more detail in an episode of its own universal credit. And we'll probably talk about, and later in this episode, we'll talk about that as a strategy letting out to people who are currently on benefits. What can we take from this? Well, it shows that strategy possibly is more riskier than it was previously because of all the changes and the uncertainty. It doesn't mean that the strategy is less desirable. I think it's the uncertainty of this new scheme and the amount of time it's being taken to roll out is really making people nervous. I mean, what's your take on this one, Rob?
Well, I think you're right. I think it is the uncertainty that's spooking people. Universal credit's been talked about for about 18 months or something. It feels like forever that people in forums have been talking about it. And it's still sort of kind of just about started, but it's all been a bit of a fiasco. And it's going to be like another 3 years before everyone's supposedly on it. The whole thing might get scrapped, of course, but if there's a change of government, it is that uncertainty. And it is coming at a time when rents are going up and benefits have gone down because of general austerity. It has become less attractive as a strategy. And I think in the article it says that something like only 1 in 5 landlords will now consider tenants on benefits, which is a problem, of course, because the private rented sector needs to pick up the slack for where there isn't enough social housing. So I don't really have any answers. I don't think anyone does, but it's going to be interesting to see how it shakes out over the next year or so. But it does tie in to our topic of the week, of course, because this week we are talking about risk and reward in property investment. And there's an example right there of someone with 1,000 properties who's made a risk-reward calculation and decided, no, I'm going to change what I'm doing. This isn't going to work for me anymore. Risk is a theme that came up as well when I was writing the book that I've just talked about. That always seemed to be something in the back of people's minds. And a lot of people were doing things that other people would consider very risky, but to them it made total sense. We're not going to get into this in this episode, into how risky property investment is compared to investing in something else or leaving your money in the bank, because everyone's going to have a different opinion on that. That's a completely different issue. But different types of investments do have different risk profiles. So what we're going to do is run through a few different strategies, just a few out of the many, many that there are, and talk about the risk and the reward of each, just to kind of give you a bit of a framework for thinking about this thing, thinking about balancing up risk and reward, and if there's anything we can learn from it in terms of the strategy that you should be adopting to give yourself a level of risk that you're comfortable with and get you towards your ultimate goal.
Okay, so let's look at our first on the list. And the first on the list is letting to LHA tenants. So what is that? Well, it's what we just talked about in the news piece. It's letting to people on benefits. And there are risks, but there are rewards for this strategy. You know, we know people who execute this strategy very, very successfully, but it's not for everyone. So what are the risks? Well, changes to government legislation affecting the business model. We just covered it. Nice, timely story, but it's true. Your model relies on the government not messing around too much, because the government is the person who pays you. If the government is paying you the money, whether it's through the tenant and then onto you or through to you directly, your model is in the hands of the government. And if they get, bored or they feel like they need a new policy, your whole strategy could be changed and altered. And what was very successful previously could become, a nightmare, or it could go the other way. What could be successful could be extremely successful because they put something in your favor. But knowing the way government changes are going at the moment, I find that hard to believe that it will go that way. Also, it's the aggravation. The tenants that you bring in have a higher risk profile as well. They may be people who are vulnerable. They may be people with mental health issues, or they may just be your everyday tenants. You don't know, but if you open the doors up to LHA tenants, then there is a possibility they may need more hand-holding and help with dealing with the local authorities so they can get their benefits set up. Not always the case, but sometimes that is possible. So you need good processes in place, good systems, something we talk about a lot, that if you do go down this route, that you have a clear defined system to make sure that this operation moves smoothly. And then there's also the potential of damage. As I mentioned, there can be some incredibly good tenants that you may find who are on benefits. That's fine. But I don't think anybody would argue that there is a higher risk of having a bad tenant. They may cause damage. They may cause trouble. I've seen a property situation where the guy just didn't collect his benefits. He went in and messed around with the benefits and the paperwork and then had it stop being paid. He may have had some issues himself, but that's the risk you take by going down this route. Okay, so they're the risks, but it's not all doom and gloom. There are rewards. There must be, otherwise people wouldn't adopt this strategy. And one of the really good rewards is the fantastic demand. As we just mentioned in that news story, landlords are pulling out of this market. So there is a really high demand, which equals low voids. So in most areas, you'll have people lined up to take these properties off your hands. Also, there's the possibility of having the benefits paid to you directly. Not always the case. It should be paid via the tenant in most cases, but there is the possibility of having it paid to you directly. If you can arrange that, then your risk is very low in terms of collecting the rent as well. Conversely, if you get it paid direct from the tenant, then you've probably got a higher risk of not getting paid. So it depends on which way you can go when you're arranging payment of rent. And finally, another reward is it's possible to get a very high ROI, return on investment. In certain areas, you can get 3-4 bedroom houses for not a lot of money, and you can get a lot of people in there, house families, so therefore the benefits paid are quite high. So the potential of the ROI is good in some types of properties. Not all. And remember, benefits are being capped in certain areas as well. But in certain areas, the ROI is very, very attractive. I know a prolific poster on Property Tribes, Jonathan Clark, operates in this sector, and he does very well by letting houses out to people on benefits. That's his core strategy, and he's very effective at that. But for a lot of people, this may seem intimidating and not the strategy they may want to adopt, especially if they're new to property investment.
Yeah, exactly. It's like Jonathan's done his risk-reward calculation, and he's decided that it works for him. I think the theme that we're going to pick up on the whole way through this episode is that you've got to look beyond the numbers, and you can't just kind of, look at the ROI on that without taking into account the risks that are there and whether you're comfortable with those or not. So HMOs are another thing where you can make really eye-popping ROIs if you know what you're doing. It's a really attractive strategy if you want a lot of cash flow quickly, because when you rent a property by the room, you can make a lot more money in some cases than when you rent it as a single unit. That's why people do it, but there are risks associated with it as well. One of those risks is that exit can be a problem. If you're looking at the big HMOs, you've got lots of rooms and you've got things like fire doors and hardwired smoke alarms. Maybe you've converted all the reception rooms into more bedrooms. If you then need to sell in a hurry, you're going to be struggling because it doesn't look like a family home anymore. It doesn't function as a family home. That means that you're going to be either having to spend a lot of money to convert it back, which is money you might not have if you're having to sell in a rush, or you're going to be having to sell it to another investor. And as we all know, investors like to beat you up on the price and not make life very easy for you. That's the whole point. So the exit strategy can be a risk. Another one is regulations. There could be new regulations at any time that you have to comply with that cost you money. Of course, there are things that you have to do when it comes to single unit buy-to-lets as well. There's just a whole extra layer of regulations on top of that with HMOs. They've become gradually more onerous over time, and you never know when your local authority is suddenly going to proclaim that you need some extra thing which is going to cost you a few £1,000s. So that's a risk as well. Another risk is conflicts between tenants because, of course, depending on how you operate it, you're likely to have sort of 4, 5, 6 or more people living together who don't know each other, who've never lived together before. So who knows what conflicts could come out of that, whether it's sort of really serious things or whether it's just people calling you up and complaining because someone's moved their milk or something. You just don't know. And so that's a risk of having your time eaten up by things going wrong. And that is another risk in itself. Like, at least something going wrong is a higher risk than if you just have a normal single family buy-to-let. Purely because you've got 5 people in a house, you've got 5 times the possible tenant variables. Like, tenants can be unpredictable people. You just never know what's going to happen. And you've also got all the strain on the building itself from having 5 people using it rather than a smaller number. That just means that something is going to go wrong, and that is a risk. It's like, are you prepared to have the risk of something going wrong? Do you have the systems to deal with it? Do you have the time and the patience to deal with it? So as a result of all these potential problems and conflicts, it can put a real strain on your time. I do know people who've got HMOs systemized to an incredible extent, and I don't know how they do it. It hardly seems to take up any of their time. But you could easily imagine just 1 or 2 becoming a full-time job. And maybe that's okay. Maybe your whole plan is to get a couple of them that cash flow so well that it replaces your full-time job. But if you're trying to sort of do it on the side, evenings and weekends, then you might not be able to find an agent who can do it for you in your area. Lots of agents won't touch HMOs, and it can end up taking up a vast amount of your time. So in order to get the reward, which we're going to come on to, you have the risk that we've run through, and we've had the drain on your time. But what are those rewards? Well, the main one we've already talked about. It's the money. HMOs can cash flow really, really well. You have to be a bit careful about calculating that cash flow because there are going to be lots of expenses as well. So there's going to be a higher amount of wear and tear. The voids are going to be harder to calculate. There's going to be lots of things that are going to have to be taken out as expenses. But even after all that, they tend to cash flow really well. Another reward is that when you get voids, they tend not to be catastrophic. In other words, if you've got 5 rooms, it's unlikely that they're all going to be empty at the same time. Even if you've got 1 or 2 rooms empty, you should still be able to cover your mortgage payment and your other outgoings. So that can be a real benefit. A great example of this is there's a lady who I spoke to in my book who combines the 2 things that we've talked about. She does HMOs for tenants who are claiming LHA. Now, to some people, that would be the riskiest thing you could imagine. We've just run through so many risk factors for both of those things. But she said to me, no, for me, the biggest risk is having a nice detached property suitable for a single family, and I can't find a single family, and it sits there empty for a few months. For me, that is the biggest risk I can imagine. She likes the fact that she's always got this demand, and if she does have a room empty, it's not such a big deal. So I thought that's a really interesting perspective on it. And I suppose another reward for this type of investment, you're never going to get bored. There's always going to be something going on.
Yeah, I can't argue with that one, Rob. I think HMOs, lots of people are initially drawn to it because of the high returns, which is obviously the reward, and they kind of hide the risk of time. For me, the biggest risk there is the time risk that you can sink into this. And what you could end up doing is creating another job. And you have to go way back to investor versus landlord. One of our first episodes, in fact, to listen to that and decide, are you happy for your portfolio to take up some of your time? Or are you going to approach this from an investor point of view? The choice is yours. It's not that one's right and one's wrong. Rob and I obviously lean towards the investment side, me probably more so. But if you want properties to become your job, then maybe it's not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, so next, off plan. Now, we've covered this in episode 33 in some detail. So what is off-plan? Well, it's quite simple. It's buying property off-plan. So new build developers will quite often allow people to go in and buy the properties off the plan. So before anything's built or before it's finished at least, you can then go and buy and put a deposit down and lock in the price. So if there's a house being built for 200,000, you can go in and say, I want that house. I'm going to commit to buying it. I'm going to exchange on it. And once it's complete, I will complete that day too. So you're exchanging on that property, committing to buying it. And often you'll be asked to leave normally a 10% deposit. So in this case, £200,000 property. So £20,000 down. And when it completes, you then will get a mortgage for most of it and top up the deposit. So what are the risks? Well, there are a few. The developer could go bust. So what happens then? If they go bust, will somebody else step in to complete it? Is there insurances involved? If not, that's pretty high risk. Also, you could buy and the property market may go up, but it could also go down. So you could lock in that 200,000, but if the property prices dip by 10%, then you've got to complete on a property worth 180 when you locked in the price at 200. So that's another risk as well. Another risk is the development could complete a lot later than the date you were given. So it could be a year from now the property is meant to complete. But what happens if it overruns? What protections have you got in place? Well, clearly that sounds quite risky as an investment strategy, and for most people it probably is. However, there are rewards, and quite a lot of people are attracted to off-plan because of the reward potential. The biggest reward is the potential ROI. If you bought that property at 200,000 and the market goes up to 220 by the time you complete, so it's going north, property prices are heading north, then in real terms, you've made 100% ROI because you've only put 20% down. And as you're going to complete, if it's worth 220, then 20,000 in, 20,000 profit by the day you complete, that's 100% return. You're going to struggle to see numbers like that anywhere else. So that's a huge, huge return by buying off plan. The other reason why people are drawn to off plan is the potential to get a good deal. You know, developers struggle to sell off plan. Not many owner-occupiers will buy off-plan because owner-occupiers, people who are buying to live in their homes, want to go in, touch it, look at the aspects, get a feel for the home. Investors aren't as worried. They just want to know, will the builder build a good property? Is it in the right area? So are the fundamentals good? And is the price good? There are other aspects, but they're the key things they're looking for. They don't really care if the kitchen's got a nice feel to it. You know, investors are looking at the return and the rental potential of the property. Now, episode 33, as I've mentioned, does cover how you can minimize a lot of those risks. So as I've described it there, off-plan property probably would scare 90% of people who are listening. But go back and listen to episode 33. There are ways of reducing, minimizing, or eliminating the risk of some of those things I've mentioned.
Okay, so we've just picked out 3 investment approaches. There are tens, if not hundreds, of different ways of doing things, but that we just picked a few. But we're forgetting something, aren't we? We should really have a yardstick to compare all these things against. We haven't really talked about normal buy-to-let, whatever that is. But that's exactly the point. It's really hard to define what normal buy-to-let is because actually every individual investment you could make is different. So, for example, if you let to a family who've got kids, there's a higher risk of damage if the kids decide to do their art project on the walls or something like that. But then there's a lower risk of them moving out and you having a void because once a family's got kids in a local school, if they're happy there, they tend to stay put and not move for a few years. Alternatively, if you let to students, there's the risk that the popularity of the local uni will fall, or a load of purpose-built blocks are going to go up, which are going to reduce your rental demand. But then on the other side, your cash flow is pretty secure because you can always get parental guarantors. And also, you know exactly when they're going to move in and out because it's going to be in line with the university term. So you don't have any unknowns and you can get your next tenants lined up months before your current ones leave. So really, that's why we left normal buy-to-let till last, because that's the thing. There is no such thing. We've just talked about a few general types of investment, and for each of those, there are some general factors that tend to be true, and we've talked about those. But each individual property is going to have all these extra variables as well. So no 2 deals are the same. So what that means is you've got this whole risk reward calculation to make in a general sense when you're taking your overall approach. But then you're going to have a whole extra risk reward calculation when you're looking at an individual property to find out what extra factors there are going to be that you have to take into account as well.
Okay, so as we've mentioned, the biggest risk potentially for a lot of investors is their time, the risk of giving away your time for the reward. As a rule, the potential of the highest rewards come when the risk is highest and the demands on your time are also the highest. So we used HMOs as an example before, but it's an easy one to look at because that's a strategy that a lot of people will consider. HMOs, again, have the potential to take up a lot of your time, and most people would consider also that strategy to carry the most risk. But, of course, the rewards tend to be higher. On the flip side, a single let to a nice, middle-aged couple with good jobs should be the lowest risk and make the least demand on your time. So the reward is lower. So it's that balance. The trick is to sort of find the right point for you in the triangle to find where it matches with you as an investor, your needs and your temperament. Think about it. If you are time poor, then some of these riskier strategies are probably not right for you. The investors I work with at RMP Property, the majority of them are people with not a lot of time to spare or don't want to give time to spare to property. They don't want a second job. They want the benefits of property investment, but they don't want the time drain. So they're prepared to maybe accept slightly less rental return for not having to give up their time because their time is far more important to them.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of the triangle of risk, reward and time. And there are so many different points within that triangle. It's like you've got sort of what you do close to one end, and then you've got really hands-on management of a big HMO at the other end and lots of things in between. So it's about finding the right point in that for your needs and your personality. But also, I think it's the fact that as well as choosing your level of risk, you can also choose the type of risk that you want to expose yourself to. I gave the example earlier of someone whose biggest fear was voids. So she chose a strategy where the risk of voids was about as low as it gets, but then she exposed herself to higher risks of other things. So the reality is always the same. Like two people will look at, say, LHA tenants, and one of them will say, oh, that's really, really risky. I wouldn't do that. And another one say, no, I totally get this. It's that other thing that's risky. The reality is exactly the same, but people have different tolerances for different types of risk. And that's why thinking about your own personality is so important when it comes to property investing. I don't think it gets talked about enough because there's no point just looking at the numbers and looking at the ROI and going, oh yeah, that's my plan. This is going to work. That's going to get me to where I need to be. If you're going to be constantly worried about what's happening, there's no point being rich if you never get any sleep. So I think that's the big takeaway for me. It's about not just the risk, but it's about the type of risk that you personally are comfortable with.
Okay. So risk versus reward, or risk and reward in property investments. Very, very important to understand. Something I talk about a lot with investors. So I'm really glad we've covered this in the podcast. But Rob, moving on to our resource of the week now. It's something, as you mentioned at the top of the show, something we've just done, something that we recommended to us by someone we follow/worship.
You pitched this to me, and if you just said what it was, I'd be like, oh, that sounds insane. I'm not going to do that. But you cleverly prefaced it by saying, Dan Andrews says you should do this. As I was like, oh, yeah, definitely. Let's do it. Dan Andrews, of course, being from the Tropical MBA podcast, our podcasting heroes. So, of course, we had to follow in his footsteps and give it a try.
Yeah, we did. So we're calling it the Dan Andrews co-working process. What it is a really intense work process where a couple of people get together and they work through a list of projects. So what happens is you put 15 minutes time aside and then you work through a task and then you have 5 minutes at the end. And then at 5 minutes, you said, did I do what I was going to say I was going to do? Yes, no. And what am I going to do with my next 15 minutes? And then you go again. Each hour, you'll end up doing 15 minutes of intense work. Now, that might not sound a lot, 45 minutes every hour, but you track your work, whether you run a business, whether you're a consultant, whether you work for someone else, you track your work over an hour. I'd be shocked if you did 45 minutes intensive work minimum every single hour. You may think you do, but when you track it, you'll find that little things will distract you for a minute here, a minute there, and you don't get as much done. Because you've got somebody accountable to you as well as you're working through this process. Oh, actually, you know what, Rob? I didn't do it. I didn't finish it. You kind of feel you've let the other person down, and you kind of push yourself even harder for that next 15 minutes. Just to repeat, you set your tasks, 15 minutes, do them on a timer, 5 minutes come up, look at what you did, look at what you're doing next 15 minutes, and go on and on. And we did, over half a day of that. We worked from 9 till past 1, and we got loads done because, as you know, dear listener, we're doing quite a bit at the moment.
Yeah, and it was really useful because we just had this giant list, and by the end of this morning, we just made a serious dent in it. We'd made loads and loads of progress. When you could do it on your own, it's kind of like a variation of the Pomodoro technique, which is where you set a timer for about 20 odd minutes and you focus really intensely on it. That's got lots of benefits in itself because it stops you from getting distracted by your emails or Facebook or whatever else. But doing it with another person does have that extra layer of accountability, like you said. There's this thing called Parkinson's law, which is that work expands to fill the time available. So it's kind of like taking advantage of that. If you give yourself a really, really small amount of time to get something done, you'll realize that actually that thing that normally would have taken you an hour, you go and you make a cup of tea in the middle and have a chat with someone and get distracted and check the Daily Mail website. Maybe that's just me.
I hope it's just you.
But you can actually get it done in 10 minutes if you really, really push yourself. So if you find yourself in a situation where you've got a big pile of things to get through, see if you can team up with someone else and give it a try. It sounds a bit mental, and we probably looked a bit mental doing it in this cafe, just kind of like having a bit of a chat, then setting a timer and bashing away at our keyboards for 15 minutes. But it really works. Give it a try.
Another app to accompany this technique is the 3030 app. It's an app that you can use as a timer. It's on iTunes, so it's available for the iPhone and the iPad. It's a great app and it's really pretty as well, which always helps. But we use that to coordinate our timings. So a really good app that you can use for the Pomodoro technique or the Dan Andrews co-working process. Of course, we'll link to more information on that process and the app in the show notes.
We will. And you must go and check out the Tropical MBA podcast to find out who Dan Andrews is, who we've christened this process after. If you don't already know, it's a really great podcast. Okay, Rob, well, I think that's about us for this week. Next week, we've got an enticing sounding episode. We're going to be talking about how to avoid a property shark.
We are. It's going to be an interesting episode. The property investment industry can change people's lives for the better and for the worse. The better, obviously, can help you expand your portfolio quicker than you would do on your own, give you guidance, give you help, mentorship. Fantastic. However, the problem is it attracts the wrong people as well. People that we're entitling sharks. People who will try and fool you, take your money, promise you the world and deliver you nothing. So next week, we're going to be talking about how to avoid those property sharks. What are the telltale signs? How can you spot them? We'll give you all the information you need next week.
And in the meantime, of course, you can check out the show notes for this episode at thepropertypodcast.com. While you're there, leave us a review if you haven't already. Leave us an iTunes review. You'll find instructions in the show notes for exactly how to navigate their weird interface and make it work. Over 150 people have already done it. We appreciate every single one of them. So please leave us a review if you support what we're doing.
And don't forget to go and order Rob's book. It's on pre-launch at the moment, so get yourself a good deal. I'm excited about it. I hope you are too.
Thank you for the plug, Rob. I appreciate it. I'm sure you'll be hearing a little bit more about that over the coming weeks. But for now, all that remains is to say thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to The Property Podcast. Make sure you join our mailing list at thepropertypodcast.com.
And remember, we love 5-star reviews. Rob even loves them more than air miles.